and welcome back to another episode of the 2020 podcast, Canada's #1 optometry podcast. I am your host, Dr. Harbir Sayan. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to join me here to learn and to grow. Always appreciate all the support. And as always, just a quick request off the top: if you get some value from the podcast, whether it's this episode or any other episode, please do share it, send a link to a friend, put it up on LinkedIn, Instagram, wherever you spend your time and wherever you communicate with your colleagues. Always trying to put out content that's going to help us be better, whether it's individually, as practitioners, or as a profession. And today's interview is a little bit of a departure from our normal type of conversation. You know, most of the time we have people on the podcast who are from the eye care industry, although when the podcast started, it actually was primarily people who are not within eye care, because I really wanted to share their perspectives. I wanted to share the perspectives of people in different industries and different professions who have built their career up to a point where we could learn from them and see the parallels, because there's often so many parallels between people who are growing in different professions, whether they're medical professionals, business professionals, lawyers, TV professionals, athletes, whatever it might be. So that was a kind of rewinding the clock 5 years. That's kind of where we started. And speaking of rewinding the clock 5 years, this episode that I'm sharing with you today is actually from 5 years ago. So the podcast started actually like 5.5 years ago almost. This episode is from just at the very beginning of COVID, April 2020. Unbelievable that's almost 5 years ago now. And at that time, I was starting to record, just sitting at home and trying to get different people on the podcast again. And this guest was Dr. Matthew Nagra, who is a naturopathic doctor who really, at the time when we spoke 5 years ago, was really doing amazing things and building his profile online and providing lots of really supportive resources for people who are looking to change their diet and change their health. Matthew himself is a vegan and has been for years, as he shares in this podcast. And a lot of what he shares online is using scientific research and scientific data to support arguments for veganism, or actually, I should say, really to support or refute whatever claims that might be out there. At the time when we spoke 5 years ago, he was starting to grow his platform. Since then, he has blown up and he has been featured on all sorts of different media outlets, and he's had discussions with some of the bigger names in sort of the healthcare industry. He's also spent a fair amount of time refuting some of the biggest names in the healthcare industry. And once again, specifically, the thing that really drew me to Matthew, and still does follow him online, is the fact that he really backs up everything he says. He shares so much scientific data, and we talk about that on the podcast. Now, I lost track of this episode. I'd lost, I think, a hard drive or something somewhere, and I just happened to recover it recently. And I went back and I listened, and I was like, okay, it's from 5 years ago. How relevant is the content, and how relevant are the topics of discussion? And I felt they were still very, very relevant. And that's credit to Matthew again. The fact that he's speaking the truth and using scientific data and resources to support his arguments means that technically his arguments should stand the test of time. And in my opinion, they have for about 5 years at least. So I wanted to share this with you because it was a really great conversation. At the time, you'll hear this, I was kind of dabbling or dipping my toes in this idea of veganism and becoming a vegetarian. It was COVID time, so we were home and we were experimenting with all sorts of recipes. At the time, as you hear me talking about it, I was into it. I was really interested in learning more. And maybe one of the most important things that I wanted to understand was, why is there such a divide between people who are vegan and people who are not, or the carnivores and the vegetarians? And how come there's so much misinformation, or potentially in this case, and we talked about this term so much during COVID, disinformation, and that's a deliberate attempt to provide the wrong information, to muddy the waters, to make it difficult for the average person to interpret the data and understand what really is the right decision or the best decision for your health. So Dr. Nagra takes the time to really explain to us why a lot of that's going on, and how we can work our way through some of that difficult information and conflicting information that's out there. So anyways, that's a long intro to tell you about this episode, but I wanted to tell you why. Because if I just threw the episode at you, you'd be kind of like, what's going on in this interview? Who is this person, and why does it sound like this is from some really old recording? Because it is. And at the time, I was just using Zoom, and I was just using whatever microphone. I think just the laptop microphone, or maybe a in-ear, whatever. So the audio is not the best. The video is definitely not. And I was almost not going to put the video up, but I thought, for anybody who does want to watch it on YouTube, I'll put it up there for you too. So, in summary, this episode is with Dr. Matthew Nagra, a doctor of naturopathic medicine. I encourage you to go check him out online. Just search his name, Matthew Nagra, and you'll find him, and you'll find all the content that he has out there. Whether you're a carnivore, or whether you're a vegetarian, or you're somewhere in the middle, or you're not really that conscious or thinking that much about what you eat, wherever you fall on that spectrum, I think you will find some value from this conversation. So please check it out, listen to the whole episode, and I will catch you guys in the next episode. Dr. Matthew Nagra, thank you so very much for joining us here on the podcast. I truly appreciate it. There's so many amazing things that you are doing. I've been following you on social media for a while, and I think it definitely resonates. A lot of what you're doing resonates with me, as I'm kind of trying to go through a lot of these changes myself. But the first thing I'd love for you to talk to us about is what a doctor of naturopathic medicine does. What is your sort of your place in the medical system, and your role for a patient.
Well, yeah, thanks for having me. And that's a good question to start off on. So we are in British Columbia primary care, meaning that we're seen similarly to, say, a general practitioner, a family doctor. We see a lot of the same stuff. We treat a lot of the same stuff. I do have prescriptive rights, so I can prescribe medications if we need to. But as a naturopathic doctor, I'm much more informed on the nutrition side of things, lifestyle, supplements, nutraceuticals. I can do acupuncture. I can do some like physical therapies as well. So I've got a pretty broad scope that way, but we just tend to go towards the less invasive, more diet lifestyle stuff first, and then leave the medications for if nothing else works, or if it's an emergency case. Obviously, if someone has a bad infection, you want to give them antibiotics. But if they're dealing with a little injury, maybe you want to do other things before throwing them on the painkillers or the muscle relaxants, So it really varies person to person.
Got it. The more of a sort of a holistic approach to medicine, which I think is absolutely necessary these days. I'll tend to go off on tangents, but the first thing that comes to mind when you're mentioning all these things to me is a lot of times, for me as well as an optometrist, I'm seeing this with my patients, that a lot of times patients are looking for that silver bullet, and a lot of, in their mind that comes as a medication, right? Prescribe me that one pill that's going to fix all these issues. Yeah. So often, in most cases, it's not that. It's a whole host of other things, and so it's really cool that you're taking that approach. So you've maybe already touched on this, but what does a typical patient look like for you, or if you can maybe describe sort of a typical day, a range of patients that you might see on an average day?
So it does vary. Obviously, patients vary from each person. So sometimes I get a lot of the plant-based community in Vancouver. So people who are already, say, plant-based or looking to go that way. So with them, it's usually pretty simple. They come in, they want to maybe get some of their levels tested for certain, say, B12, iron, and whatnot. And then they want to just like go through their diet, make sure they're doing everything right, make sure they're supplementing where they need to, and all that. So that's a pretty simple visit. Other patients with, say, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, history of heart disease, and these are the patients where we're doing a far more comprehensive intake, finding out when this began, what sort of medications or treatments they've had along the way, and then we're coming up with a more full-on nutrition protocol for them, as well as some other lifestyle things that they can do, and possibly some supplements here and there. But then I also get some of the people coming in with chronic injuries. So I'll deal with patients who have just chronic shoulder issues or chronic back issues, and we'll do all sorts of like soft tissue massage work around that. I'll do some acupuncture if we need to, and then I can do adjustments similar to, say, a chiropractor as well. So do some of that. So it does vary person to person, but each visit is fairly long. An initial visit's an hour, so we do take a really detailed history on the person, and then for follow-ups, usually I do about half hour, which is still significant, to see how they're doing over the past few weeks since the last visit, and then also leave a good chunk of time to actually do some treatment as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So yeah, it sounds more and more like you're like a combination of
Mhm.
healthcare professionals. That's very cool. So you got your sort of your GP part in there, and like you're saying chiropractic, and even however else you might want to phrase it, but like sort of this more traditional type of
Yeah.
school treatment options as
Yeah,
well.
we actually have a really broad scope. Just people don't know it because obviously I'm not going to practice everything we learn. There's just too much, right? So you
Yeah,
focus in on these specific areas that you're drawn to, and other people are going to be doing more herbal and botanical medicine and stuff. That's great too. Not really my forte, not what I'm best at, and not what I'm most passionate about. So it does vary, and there's just so much you can do in the field.
right. Speaking of what you're passionate about, that's the perfect segue, and you've already mentioned it. You are very passionate about the benefits of being on a plant-based
Mhm.
diet, right? And you're vocal about it, and I don't mean that in any kind of negative connotation. You share a lot of information about the benefits of plant-based diets. So can you tell me when that happened? Because I assume that wasn't from day one, but there was a change somewhere where you decided that was the right thing for you, and then what you want to share with people.
Yeah, when I was younger, I dealt with asthma, allergies. I was overweight. I had some, health issues, long-term health issues. My dad actually had some heart issues too when he was really young, like 40 years old. Um, and then I had a personal trainer when I was in high school. That was 11 years ago, and he really promoted more of like a plant-based or plant-forward diet. A lot of more raw foods. He was very against dairy in particular,
Hmm.
and I never really took him seriously. And then at one point, he told me to write a food diary, so write down everything I ate for a couple of weeks so that they could track it. And that's the point where I was like scared he was gonna see what I ate and know how bad it was. So I decided to cheat him a little bit, and for those couple of weeks, I cut out all the dairy, I cut out all the junk food. I didn't want to lie on the sheet, so I did want to actually do it,
Okay.
and felt better. Started losing weight. My asthma just like went away. My allergies got way better. Um, and then so over the course of the next couple of years, right, this was starting 11 years ago, I started to learn more and more about it, and then eventually went to university, and I'm back on the cafeteria food and parties on weekends and all that. So I started to slide the other way again, and I was able to realize that, hey, I'm not feeling quite as healthy or as good as I was before. I want to get back to that. And so I just overnight, in my second semester, I just decided there on the spot. I think I was probably hungover or something. I don't even know, but I wasn't feeling great, and I
Right.
just
Yeah, yeah,
decided
yeah.
that I was going to go all in, and so I did, right on the spot.
That's wow, fantastic. Just like that, cold turkey.
Hmm.
Um, I guess you'd done it before, so you had a bit of an idea of what to do. But that's amazing that you had that self-awareness, because I can tell you from my personal perspective that I could, on an average day, or in the past I would have said I feel fine. I can go for a run. I can play sports. I can do all these things. Go to work. But when I started to truly analyze it, I was like, well, maybe I don't have as much energy at this time of day that I'd like to have, or maybe I feel a little bit something or other at this point. And as I've kind of mentioned to you before, I've been trying to make some of those changes myself. I'm definitely not anywhere being fully plant-based, but I've been constantly trying to reach in that direction, and
Hmm.
I've definitely noticed some changes myself. Um, the next thing is, again, going kind of back to the being vocal and being a big proponent of this. It seems to me that this sort of debate around plant-based diets is so polarizing. It's shocking to me that there's such such disparity. There's people who are like crazy carnivores, and there's the
Right.
carnivore diet, in
Yeah.
fact, right? And then there's people like yourself and others, who are experts in their own right, who are extremely vocal about this. And it just seems like people are constantly butting heads, and I'm just curious as to, like, why do you think it's so heated and so polarizing?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of passion involved. So something that is often overlooked is people will point at me or point at others who are in plant-based, and they'll say, "You're vegan, you're biased." But what they're not realizing is their own bias. So I usually ask them, well, do you enjoy eating meat? Does the thought of giving up meat and other animal products kind of deter you, or does it cause some kind of fear or some kind of feeling like that? And most of the time it's yeah. And so there is that emotional bias for it. They don't want to give it up. On the second hand is there are anecdotes, right? People will do this low carb short term, yeah, you'll have some weight loss, but you'll plateau out. It's long term. And for long term health effects, we look at low carb diets, they're not good for the vast majority of the research out there shows that they aren't good long term. But when someone does that, they feel great, they lose weight within the first couple of weeks. Mind you, that's temporary.
Mhm.
They're going to want to jump on board. Whereas we're looking at long-term health, right? We're looking at the populations that live longer than anybody else in the world. And with the carnivore people, the thing that's the most frustrating is that they will point to our science and say it's not good enough. It's epidemiology, which means we're looking at like populations of people. We're not taking their diets, changing it, and seeing what happens. We're just looking at what they're already doing. The fact of the matter is they have no science. So they're pointing at our science saying it's not good. There are 0 randomized controlled trials on the carnivore diet, period. There's just nothing out there. So there is this debate, but it's largely emotional, I think. I think when you actually look at the science and what we have, I'm not going to say 100%. You need to be 100% whole foods, plant-based, have optimal health. But I think the science is pretty clear that the best diet is going to be around 95 to 100%. That's if you have a little bit of, the Okinawans in Japan, for example, they have meat about once every 2 to 4 weeks.
Oh,
If
wow.
you're doing that, is that going to cause a lot of harm? Probably not. If you smoke 1 cigarette a month, is it really going to hurt you? Probably not. But why do it if you don't have to? Unless if you have some specific reason for wanting to do that, if you're really craving it from a health standpoint, probably not going to hurt too much. But certainly not necessary. And we do have research showing that predominantly or exclusively plant diets are super healthy.
Mhm. We're going to touch in because I definitely have more questions on
Mhm.
the science-backed stuff,
Yeah.
the actual true data, because that's how my brain works for the most part, but emotions definitely come into play. You're right. Um, I I love eating meat types of dishes, right? But I've been definitely cutting a lot of them out, and we'll go in a little bit more detail about that too. But I wanted to, because I know I've seen multiple posts from you about this, but the movie Game Changers, a
Mhm.
lot of people have seen that, and it's come up in a lot of discussions with just friends and family.
Mhm.
And I feel like it for me, anyways, as just sort of the layperson, kind of viewing it from my outside view, it seemed like it totally reignited this whole debate.
It
Everybody
did.
on like all these different podcasts I listen to, all of a sudden is either like, "Wow, that movie's amazing," or "Oh my God, that was just totally bogus and everything they said was garbage," and then they're
Mhm.
trying to bring on experts to disprove it. Um, so first off, I want to know kind of what your overall. I assume you found that it was beneficial overall, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the movie as a whole and what they were trying to showcase.
Yeah, so I actually got to see it a year before it came out. I did see it at an early screening at a conference, actually, and I'd been waiting for a full year for it to finally be released. It was supposed to be released far earlier, and then there was all sorts of delays. And but finally, yeah, it got out there. It sparked a lot of debate, a lot of discussion. And so I've heard all the arguments, and a lot of them are arguing about things that they actually addressed in the movie. So, for example, there's the famous erection scene. Everyone's losing their mind over that. And a lot of people who are criticizing the film, they'll say, "Well, that's not scientific how they designed it," and I'll agree. But guess what? They said that in the movie.
They actually said
Dr.
it.
Dr. Aaron Spitz said right after, "Now, this is not a scientifically validated study, but the results we're seeing are encouraging," I think was the word that he used. And right now, that study is being done. Since the movie came out, that study,
All right.
a randomized crossover trial, is actually being done. So we'll have real results on that pretty soon.
Hmm.
Um, so that was one that often came up. Another one is I saw a lot of people jumping at the whole gladiator topic in the beginning. James Wilkes, the main guy in the film there, the producer, he first got this kind of clue that, hey, maybe plant-based diets are healthy because he'd read some research on the gladiators who were all-star athletes at the time, were predominantly plant-based. And then everyone's saying, well, this movie's saying that plant-based diets are healthy just because the gladiators ate it. And I was like, no, that was just literally what sparked the thought for him. And then the rest of the movie's about the science. So a lot of the arguments I just don't think hold up very well. And I do think they did a fantastic job. Now there has been a lot of people all over Joe Rogan's podcast. He had Chris Kresser on there to debunk it. But then,
Mm.
and I'll give Joe props for this, he brought on James Wilkes to
We did.
actually debate. Yeah, so you should watch that if you haven't. It's long, but it's great.
Yeah,
He
no,
brought on,
I love Rogan's podcast, and I saw your post debunking the
yeah,
debunking,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
I love that. It was fantastic, but please go on.
Yeah, so he brought on James Wilkes and Chris Kresser at the same time so that they can actually have a discussion, and James wiped the floor. Like, he just totally destroyed Chris on all the points that he made and pointed out all the flaws in his argument. And the arguments that he was using are pretty much the same as what everybody else is using. So I think that was a huge service to the plant-based movement and to the movie. And even Joe Rogan said afterwards that James convinced him that it is healthful. And that's coming from a guy who's very vocally anti-vegan. Like, he
Big
said it
time.
was so convincing that he actually thought about taking down the original debunking video.
Wow.
Yeah.
Good for Rogan for being willing to kind of take that too, because he's a massive figure. You know, a lot of people listen and watch.
Massive influence.
You know, he's got massive influence. And so when he did that debunking one, I was like, oh, this sucks, because so many people and like really good friends of mine who love Rogan, right? So I'm like, dang it, they're gonna all be like, look, Rogan, and they did in fact message me like, look, Rogan said. I was like, no, go check out Matthew's post. And, you know, and I directed them over to you because I knew from listening, I was like, a lot of this, again, like you said, is like emotional or like based on anecdotes or old science or incomplete science. And I was still just sort of beginning my journey into kind of trying to establish, you know, this sort of diet for myself. But I know if Rogan says it, a lot of people are listening. So it's really cool that he's willing to go back
100%.
and put his sort of reputation on the line there. That's really cool. So yeah, there were a few things in there that you know, they were, I think, very transparent about, like, okay, this is not a scientific based study. This is something we're working on, but it's enough that it kind of piques people's interest and starts conversations. You know, let's stick with game changers for a second. So one of the things that I know you've posted about, and I've heard a lot of questions about from other people, and I'm no expert in this, so I don't have an answer other than directing them to your page, is the soy conversation. So a lot of people talk about soy is bad, it's estrogenic, is that the right term?
Yeah, that's what people say,
Yeah, and yet in the movie they were saying it's phytoestrogens are different, and I know that I've had a little bit of trouble wrapping my head around it, and a lot of others do as well. Can you give us just like a 2-minute thing on what the difference is?
So soy, they contain phytoestrogens. So they don't contain true estrogens that we produce in our bodies or that animals produce in theirs. And so they're about 1,000 times weaker than the estrogens we produce. Now, dairy, for example, actually contains true mammalian estrogens. So consuming dairy is actually going to be more of an estrogenic food. As far as its effects on our body, though, so let's say, and I'm going to oversimplify here. There's like different types of receptors and we can get really technical, but to oversimplify.
Personally, I would love to, I could talk to you for hours on that, but for the
To oversimplify, let's say your body's producing too much estrogen. Okay. So now you're going to have these weaker estrogens. They're 1,000 times weaker, bind up some of the receptors. That's going to block your own body's estrogens from binding. So you've actually decreased the estrogenic response in your body. Now, let's say you're not producing enough estrogen. Well, then you're going to be able to fill up some of the other receptors with weak estrogen. So you can actually bump up the estrogenic response a little bit. And so it can actually work both ways. That's why women who consume the most soy, if we look at, say, Asian countries, they actually have reduced risk of breast cancer. Even women with genetic mutations that put them at greater risk of breast cancer have a reduced risk of breast cancer. And women who have survived breast cancer have a lower risk of another bout of breast cancer. So it's across the board. It's good for that. It's also beneficial for reducing menopausal symptoms. There are no signs of feminization in men of all the large scale studies we have, but there are a couple case studies of individual guys, 2 of them that I know of, where they were consuming like 4 liters of soy milk and other, tofu and soy products on top of that. And they actually did have a little bit of gynecomastia. So, it's possible, but like you have to really, really overdo it to get there. Otherwise, it's just beneficial. And in men, it reduces risk of prostate cancer. So, or at least it's shown to do so. So yeah, there's just benefit across the board. There isn't really a risk. It's a great source of protein, calcium, iron, fiber. I definitely wouldn't limit it.
Okay, that's fantastic to hear. And I assume that the things that you're commenting on here, the lowering risk of breast cancer and all these, it's science-based.
They're all in my posts. I've talked about them.
I know that's where you come from, but just for clarification. So when you say that, somebody has a lower risk of prostate cancer or breast cancer, is that compared to somebody who doesn't consume dairy and soy, or is it compared to somebody who consumes dairy and they replace it with soy?
So a lot of these large scale epidemiologic studies, how they design them is they'll break up the, say, soy consumers into 4 quartiles. So there's the lowest, kind of mid-low, mid, high, and then high range. That's usually how it works. Sometimes they'll do 5 categories, but then you compare the highest consumers to the lowest consumers, or the non-consumers, and then you'll show that the highest consumers have a lower risk. But at the same time, they do what's called a multivariate regression analysis, where they actually compare people who say smoke to people who smoke, and people who don't smoke to those who don't, and those who exercise to those who exercise. And so and then the same goes with food. They'll try to match up as best they can, say dairy consumers across the board or wherever, and it varies from study to study a bit, but they try to control for as many of those confounding variables as possible. Overall, I wouldn't worry about that too much. With dairy though, we actually have pretty solid evidence on prostate cancer. We have a recent study that linked dairy to breast cancer, although over the long term, the research on breast cancer has been a little mixed, but the prostate cancer link is pretty strong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it's the same types of people who are having these like clashing perspectives. There's a very heated debate about dairy versus non-dairy. And actually that's going to kind of lead me into the next thing that I wanted to ask you about, which is I think kind of the big unfortunate issue right now, just across the board, North America, Europe, for sure North America, maybe I won't speak to Europe, but in media and social media, there's just so much information regarding nutrition, and there's all sorts of experts, and what, they may truly be experts, PhDs and all this other stuff, and researchers, but there's just constantly conflicting information that is supposedly science, and it's hard for even an educated person, somebody who's trying to read up on it, to stay up to speed with what's good, what's not. Sometimes eggs are good, sometimes they're not. Sometimes dairy is good, sometimes it's not. Red meat's good, red meat's not. It's hard to know what is what. And so I'd like for you to, if you can, comment on why there's so much disagreement, why sometimes something is advertised as good and sometimes is advertised as bad, and how the average person should go about getting to the bottom of what's right and what's wrong.
So
Sorry, that's a loaded question.
Yeah, why that's happening is largely money. That's going to be more than anything. If dairy was getting hammered through the early 2000s, they were just getting destroyed because of the fear around saturated fat and cholesterol and all that. And so they have annual meetings between all the dairy companies. And so they had this meeting down in Mexico. I think it was 2008. And this isn't some conspiracy theory stuff I'm talking about here. They published the notes from their meetings. You can read them. And I've referenced them in my posts on dairy, so people can go there and they can have access to that. And so they were actually wanting to reach out to some of their friends in the scientific community to combat the negative views of saturated fat. So we see next few weeks, research on saturated fat and cholesterol disease. They're very flawed. One of them actually did get active, and they had to add some stuff and put it back out. That's a lot of what's going on here. Eggs is one of the classic ones where it's back and forth all the time. Mind you, with eggs, it's actually funny. If you eat a really poor diet, adding eggs doesn't actually increase your risk. But if you eat a healthy diet, if you're very healthy, like next to no cholesterol, and you eat predominantly plant-based, well, then eating eggs will actually quite starkly worsen your risk. So there's ways to play with these groups of people that you're using for studies a little bit as well. As for the average person, it's tough. It's tough to really know what to believe, what not to believe. I do recommend following some people, whether it be myself or whoever who you trust their views. Nutritionfacts.org is great. Dr. Michael Greger there is always putting out the latest research on any given topic. He's actually got a webinar coming up in a week on pandemics. So he's going to be talking about obviously coronavirus and the research that we do have on that, even though it's pretty in its infancy right now. And so there's people like that who are just really good at breaking down the science and conveying it to the public. I think those are the sorts of people you need to follow, because you can't expect everyone to be able to sift through this. I'm not always great at it. I usually have to, if there's something really conflicting with the general balance of evidence, I have to go through it quite a few times to really see hey, what's going on here? Why are we getting these results? And so, yeah, nobody's perfect at it. Everybody's going to have a little bit of a different interpretation, but yeah, it's definitely important to follow people who you believe to be really good at it.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the tough part here is that even for somebody like yourself who is reading a lot of the science, it's tough to kind of sift out some of um, the nuances there between different studies. But in general, would you suggest, and I mean, this is kind of seems like a silly question to ask, would you suggest that we all consider going on a plant-based diet?
Yeah, and I should actually add about the research is we also shouldn't focus on a specific study that comes out. So if one study comes out that supposedly debunks the century of research we had before that,
Yeah.
well then we should look at the overall balance of evidence. If the balance of evidence still says what we've always known, well then it's a good bet that there's some kind of flaw in the later study. Not always, but a good bet. Now, as for everybody going plant-based, I think there's only really benefit there. People who are plant-based tend to have better micronutrient status, so they're consuming and their levels of all the micronutrients tend to be better, lower risk of deficiencies. It's the number one reason you, I, or anybody else is going to die is heart disease. It's the only diet proven to reverse heart disease in the majority of people. That should be a no-brainer. The fact that it's also great for type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, liver disease, kidney disease, prostate cancer, breast cancer, weight loss, like those are all just bonuses really after the heart disease picture. So yeah, I do think anybody can succeed on it. There are some nuances. Some people might have allergies or sensitivities to specific foods, but in the long run, you just modify it to each individual person. You cater it to them, and that's what I do in my practice a lot.
Got it. So on that note, if somebody was considering starting or kind of working towards becoming plant-based, I've seen on your website there's things like the 80-20 types of principles and that kind of thing. Where would you suggest somebody start? Let's say, somebody who eats meat for most meals of the day and has for years and has trouble kind of cutting it out, doesn't know where to start. What would you suggest?
I'd say start with one meal. Start with breakfast. That's usually the easiest one. You switch from, if you're doing bacon and eggs, you switch to oatmeal smoothies, or you can do a chickpea omelet or a tofu scramble. Like there's a bunch of options there, but just get that one meal down. Once you've done that, move on to lunch. And once you've dialed that for a couple of weeks, go on to dinner. And that's a pretty good way to do it. What I tend to do in practice is I look at what you already eat. So let's say you're eating, we'll go with the bacon and eggs for breakfast, sure. And then say for lunch, you're doing a tuna sandwich, and for dinner, you're doing spaghetti or something, just to give you an example. Well, for breakfast, we'll throw out the bacon and eggs, but we can do a tofu scramble. It's still somewhat similar to eggs. And you can even do some, I usually don't recommend in the long term for overall health, but you can do some mock meats or, fake meats on the side. They're just during transition period. For lunch, if you're doing, say, a tuna sandwich, well, maybe we just swap that for a veggie sandwich with tofu, and you can do some hummus on there and some veggies, and that's pretty good, and with a whole wheat bread, of course. And then instead of say you're doing spaghetti with meat sauce before, well, we'll switch to tomato-based sauce. We'll throw out the white noodles and put whole wheat in, maybe toss some chopped broccoli into the sauce, maybe some beans or ground tofu as well, and there you go. We've just veganized your whole day, but you're eating fairly similar foods to what you're already eating. Mm-hmm. And I find that that's an easy way to do it, is just kind of look at what you're already doing and see how you can modify it.
Fair enough. I think that's a great way to go. One of the concerns that I know when I talk to friends, and personally too, I should say, one of my concerns was, so for example, I was the bacon and eggs guy in the morning, and now I have an avocado toast, and or I do that chickpea scramble sometimes, or omelet. But a lot of times when you're doing these replacements, you're adding carbs, or you tend to be eating more carbs. Even with lentils and black beans and all these other things, they have lots of protein. And of course, we talked kind of early in the conversation here about how these no carb diets or low carb diets are really popular, and there are a lot of just meat and vegetables, right? And then so where do we sit on that? Like, are we against carbs? Are we for carbs? Are we okay with it? What do you say?
So again, we want to stay away from the low carb diets based on the largest research we have. But there was a study that came out a couple of years ago, and it was a big systematic review. So they looked at all the research on these different diets, different carbohydrate intakes. And they actually found that the worst outcomes were with the super low carb diets. But then there was kind of a peak around 50-55% of your calories coming from carbs. And then the health outcomes actually got a little bit worse as we went further into like the 60-70% carb range. However, what they didn't do in those studies was they didn't separate out processed refined carbs from whole food carbs, the carbs that we're going to get from whole grains, beans, fruits, and so on. So then when researchers later did that and they divided up, or they split up all the different foods, they actually found that the risk kept going down if you were eating the whole food carbs. And so that's what we know.
Ate a higher percentage of carbs.
Yeah. But from whole foods specifically, the lower your risk, the lower your mortality risk overall. So we know that whole food carbs, these whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, are super healthy. And actually the single food most linked to longevity are legumes. Beans are the single food most linked to longevity. And with whole grains, and this is funny, I always have people talking crap about whole grains, your brown rice and everything. That's based on research looking at refined grains a lot of the time. They're looking at research on, say, white rice, and they're extrapolating it to brown rice. It's not the same thing. Brown rice will have a slower glycemic response, a slower raising of your blood sugar. And there is not a single study showing that whole grains are inflammatory. Okay, that's what often, because if you raise blood sugars really high, you get inflammation, and that's not good. And that's why people want to avoid, say, white rice or refined grains. But with whole grains, there's not a single one. There's just not one out there in all the millions of studies ever been published, nothing. And it's one of the very few areas of all of science really where it's completely one-sided, but people still argue against it, and it doesn't make any sense to me. Same with diabetes, for example. Fruits and whole grains, there's not a single study showing that they increase risk of diabetes. They all reduce risk of diabetes, actually. So there's no real reason to fear these carbs at all.
Okay. I think that's really important for a lot of people to hear, because it's sort of been beat into, especially I feel like in the fitness community and stuff like that, there's a lot of conversation about cutting carbs. And I'll speak from my personal experience, because I've gone through different phases. And I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, I did that super low carb, like a paleo diet or whatever it was called at the time, and wow, there was a massive difference in my physique. But, I'd stuck to it for maybe a year or so. Now my goal is what's going to keep me healthy for the longest period of time. Like, I want to be completely healthy on my feet, running around till I'm 100. So what's going to help me get there? And it sounds like, this kind of thing is what I need to do. So if there was one food, maybe 2 or 3, let's say, if you can, that you suggest everybody should avoid, big X on.
Okay. Okay, number 1 would be processed meat. It's class 1 carcinogen. We know it causes cancer. Don't eat it. Second, I would say, is red meat, because it's a probable carcinogen, meaning that it probably causes cancer. And that's based on the World Health Organization after they reviewed over 800 studies. And then if I was to pick a third one, I would say refined sugar. It's a good one.
Okay. Yeah. So when we say processed meat, can you give us a few ideas of what that is?
Yeah, bacon, sausage, lunch meats, sandwich meats, bologna, those sorts of things.
It's crazy how, especially like lunch meats, how prominent and like ubiquitous those are. Every kid's taking
on children. Yeah, that's the scary part is that it's being sent to, with kids to school, and actually processed meat, just even a single sausage a day, can raise lung cancer risk. I think it was about 16 to 18%. Now, living with a smoker, so constant exposure to secondhand smoke, raises lung cancer risk about 15%.
Oh, wow.
So if you're not smoking around your kid because you don't want to give them cancer, well, then you shouldn't be sending them to school with lunch meats either.
Yeah,
so.
right. Wow. Gosh, That's what I ate for like, I don't know how many years throughout
Me
my
too.
teenage years and everything. Crazy. All right. Well, this is amazing information, and I truly could ask you so many more questions. I think maybe I'd love to have you back on at some point if we can, to touch on some more topics, maybe in a bit more detail. But, to kind of wrap up, there's always a couple of questions that I ask every patient, every person that I interview, every person that comes on the podcast, every guest, I should say. And so the first one is, a little more of kind of philosophical turn here, away from science and nutrition. If you could go back to yourself at any point in your life, and you can explain what specific scenario that is if you'd like, or if you just want to kind of share the advice, but what advice would you give yourself at a specific point where maybe you were struggling and you needed a little bit of motivation that would have helped you get to where you are to help you succeed?
I would probably go back to when I was in university, in my undergrad, when I was kind of figuring out what I wanted to do, and I was thinking about doing naturopathic medicine. I was thinking about conventional medicine. I was going back and forth a little bit, and I think I would just tell myself not to doubt myself, because that's what I kept, like I was doing a little bit at the time. It was really hard to determine which route I wanted to go, and I was doubting whether naturopathic medicine could work, if it'd be successful at it, and if I'd be able to build a career out of it, and so that's probably where I would go, and what I would say.
That's great. That's great, because I know that is an important juncture for a lot of
Mhm.
people, trying to figure out which profession to go into, and there's a lot of pressure societally and otherwise that forces people into certain professions. Maybe they don't end up loving them ultimately. So that's great that you'd suggest that. And the last question, with everything that you're doing, because I know you're involved in so many different things, lots of great initiatives, and you're building, your professional career. Everything you've done up until now, how much of it would you say is due to luck, and how much of it is due to hard work?
Ooh, I would say I don't know if I give a percentage. I would say the majority's been hard work for sure, but I've certainly been lucky. I've gotten to, mind you, it's because I attended these conferences, but not only did I get to meet a lot of my heroes in the plant-based movement, a lot of the doctors who are doing this great research, but I've actually become friends and colleagues with so many of them now, and we keep in touch. I ask for advice from them, and I feel like there's definitely some luck involved there. The fact that there's thousands of people here, and somehow I've been able to build these relationships. So I'd say there's a bit of luck there too, but definitely mostly it's been working at it.
Great. That's great. Um, so, Dr. Matthew Nagra, where can people find you? Where's the best place for people to contact you and see your content?
So I'm most active on Instagram. That's at Dr. Matthew Nagra. It's dr.Matthew Nagra. So definitely follow me there. I have a website, drmatthewnagra.com, and I have a booking link there. I also have my contact info there, so you can email if you need to for anything. And other than that, I'm on Facebook. I'm not as active there as I am on Instagram, but I have Dr. Matthew Nagra ND. So those are kind of the best places, I think, to follow me, and definitely reach out, send a message.
Perfect. Awesome. Please, guys, do check out Dr. Nagra's pages, and his content is incredible. And for anybody who is, whose mind is a little more scientific, you'll love it, because he gives references for every single thing. I feel like your list of references is longer than your content.
Sometimes, yeah.
It's crazy, but really, really amazing stuff. Thank you so much, Dr. Nagra, for coming on the show. I truly appreciate it. And I hope we can stay in touch and maybe do another episode sometime.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much.
All right, there you have it. That was a conversation with Dr. Matthew Nagra, doctor of naturopathic medicine. I hope you guys found that episode insightful and useful, and found some information in there that you can share, use in your own life, but maybe share with some of your friends and family as well. A little departure from what we've recently been posting on the 2020 podcast, but I was kind of happy to find this episode and share it with you, even though it was from 5 years ago. I'll be back next week with a very important episode. I hope you guys stay tuned for a conversation with the one and only Dr. Martin Spiro, who is the president of the Canadian Association of Optometrists. Very big, very important conversation. So stay tuned for that next week on the 2020 podcast, Canada's #1 optometry podcast. I'll see you guys then.